Hello, everyone. I'm Ashlee George, who she, her, hers, and I'm with the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice. We're a national research and innovation center that supports work that's around preventing folks from going inside the system while folks are inside the system, making sure they're treated humanely and creating opportunities for folks when they're returning to communities to be welcomed and supported. This discussion is around returning, it's called Returning to Ourselves, Pathway Towards Healing Individually and Collectively Through Restorative Justice. And so it's really a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you, Center for Community Justice and all of the Elkhart community for inviting me to this presentation and that I get to be part of this event. So really happy to share what I know, what I love about restorative justice. As in order to start, I want to take a moment to honor the land and honor the original stewards of this land, the stewards who are currently shepherding, leading work, advocates, all the elders, all the youth advocates, and to acknowledge and recognize their fight to be visible. And so I want to honor the Ottawa, the Chippewa, and the Potawatomi folks, the tribes here in Elkhart community, and then also the Ohlone of the Oakland region, and that's the region that I'm in. I also want to acknowledge my lineage. I'm the daughter of Colin and Tamara by the way of the American South, specifically Arkansas and Louisiana. I also have lineage from the global South, Guyana, and South America. I want to honor my ancestors who are part of the tribe of folks who were forced into enslavement, who crossed the Middle Passage, acknowledging the legacy of myself and of the tribes that I don't know specifically and I can't name by name, but who I feel connected to and connected to the land and to the people and to my lineage in Africa, and the powerful bond and the gratitude that I have for my relatives that I know and the relatives I don't know by name. Also want to thank and give gratitude to all of my elders and all my family, my loved ones who prayed over me and who shown me so much love and compassion, and then also honoring my ancestors who have passed on, who have paved the way for me to be here today. So, in looking with, thinking about the year 2020, so this has been a year. The year started off with the announcement of the global pandemic. And from the global pandemic with COVID-19, we have lost 240,000 people here in the States. And so there's a level of grief that's here, grieving people that we've lost, family members that we can't connect with, jobs, ways of being and connecting that we are usually very familiar with doing. In addition to what's happened with the global pandemic, there's also another pandemic that we were reminded of, and it's racism. And it was brought to our attention early on in the year with the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, and then of Breonna Taylor, and of George Floyd. And so, as a nation, we're facing the grief of loss and through from COVID-19, also feeling a sense of rage and sadness about the killing and the lack of care and seeing the humanity and the dignity of folks and of Black bodies in this country. And so many people have organized this year protests and to stop the injustice and to say Black Lives Matter, all Black Lives Matter. And then also this year, Mother Nature was at work, and so we've had several hurricanes. We even are currently still having hurricanes in Florida, and the West Coast has been with the wildfires. There have been hundreds of wildfires all along the West, And so this message, Eric Gardner's final words, he was slain by law enforcement in New York City. He said, "I can't breathe." And this is a literal and figurative meaning in three different ways. One, people feeling that they cannot breathe because uh, of the pandemic, like it attacks our respiratory, it attacks our lungs. The wildfires out west, folks not being able to breathe because there was smoke, and in the smoke, it was, ash was falling, and it was actually toxic. And then finally, especially figuratively for the Black community, feeling suffocated and feeling marginalized in the burden of systemic oppression and how that impacts the body physically, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. And all of this is occurring while we're in election season, and this election being shown that as a nation we're pretty divided. A lot of people had turned out for the election. Over 70 folks have voted for one candidate. Over 75 folks have voted for another candidate. And so there's this deep divide. And so discussions on like how do we move forward, how do we move together, what's going to be the next steps, and thinking about that. So 2020 has had some moments, but it's also had some really, really, really amazing moments. So we elected the first woman, Black woman, South Asian woman, daughter of immigrants, uh, to the White House as the vice president elect. So we have Madam Vice President elect, my senator from California, raised in Oakland, from Oakland, Kamala Harris. In addition to her being a fierce leader and a visionary, we also have to mention her the first time having a second husband of Jewish descent, Doug Imhoff, excuse me. We also have a president-elect Joe Biden, who's been a public servant for over 50 years, deeply empathetic man, and he suffered great loss, an unimaginable loss, and has overcome disability, and has supported his child through, or family members through, addiction. And so he lives a life of compassion and service, public service. So with all of this, we have a lot going on. And so, one thing that was shared by President-elect Joe Biden was around the sense of, he named different communities in his speech and wanted to thank them for their support and thank them for and that he sees them. And one community he named was the disabled community. And on social media, I saw many different people talking about like how important it was for him to say that. And that was the first time that they have heard that from a presidential candidate, a presidential electee, or a president, to specifically name that community, and how important it was to be seen and feel visible. And so we're going to talk about that, like what it means to be visible, what does it mean to be seen, as we explore restorative justice. And so 2020 is provided with a lot of insight about like what does this year mean, and how do we move forward, and what way do we want to move forward. So when I think about restorative justice, I think about this bed of leaves that just really hold the space and create the environment for openness to share. And so restorative justice is a modern term coined by Howard Zinn over 40 years ago, but it's a practice that Indigenous communities, First Nations communities around the world have long relied on, and what we call restorative justice has been used to create community and address conflict in ways that preserve and that strengthen the collective bonds. And so this is practiced by a name different, and there's no monolith for Indigenous communities, especially here in the States, in Canada, First Nations, and also Aotearoa with the Maori folk. And so it's practiced in different ways, but restorative justice is essentially about relationships. How do we build them? How do we sustain them? How do we nurture these relationships? And when a harm does occur, when a wrongdoing occurs, when there's conflict, how do we address that in a way that centers the relationship? And so restorative justice is also a set of values. It's a set of beliefs. There are different practices. So you may hear of circle process, peacemaking circles, as well as a set of values. And with that, and beliefs. And as we're thinking about the ethos of restorative justice, there's different aspects to it. It's more than just a program. And thinking about the power, especially being in circle, and the ability to connect with others and listen and allow for the collective wisdom and the collective agency to surface. And so that's another central piece that, like, we say there's no experts in restorative justice. I think I might even said in my bio, or people say like, "Oh, she's an expert," but like really, there's no experts. Like when we're sitting in circle and when we're talking about it, or with even someone who's like really new, like as you're talking about it, there's a way that we understand how to be, and it respects the wisdom may come from someone who's an expert, or it may come from someone doesn't seem as expert, but because we all see each other, we value everyone's opinion, that it's okay. Like that the circle holds that space. So it's really valuing the collective. Um, yeah. It names and it says that we are all interconnected. So conflict and tension and the relationships that we have, they ripple out and they affect and they impact one another. When there is a harm or when a harm does occur, it restorative justice seeks to support the person who's been harmed, survivors, and it's different. It's a shift in paradigm. It's asking us to see the world differently. It's asking us to be with one another differently. It's asking us to center our relationships. And currently, what we have is we have a system that will isolate, that will separate, that will punish. And the thought is that through punishment, that people will learn a lesson and that they will understand how their actions have impacted others without ever having the conversation. And so in this world where we're like really practicing restorative justice, we're doing truth telling. We're talking about accountability, not just truth telling accountability interpersonally, right? But as a collective, like who are the people that we need to be honest with? Who are the folks who historically have been harmed, that have been marginalized, that we have not taken account for? We need to take account for that. And so practicing taking responsibility, practicing being accountable and ask, like, how can I make this right? Practicing being honest and truth telling is one of the ways to move forward. And until we have those processes, until we have those conversations, until we let people talk about and share what's happened to them and be heard and be seen and be valued, then it makes it difficult, and it prevents a blockage to be able to move forward. And so I really appreciate with restorative justice the ability to hold and to allow everyone to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And it's not always easy taking responsibility. It's not always easy having someone take responsibility, and witnessing that. But it creates the opportunity for folks, if they want to do that, to step into that place, and the power and the transformation that can occur when we take accountability, when we name our relationships, and we honor our connections to one another. And then the last thing is dignity. Every person is valued, and no one is disposable. We can't send anyone away. There's nowhere to send them because they actually belong here. And maybe at different points, for whatever reason, there needs to be space and distance. But where do we create a society where people can be held and supported through an accountability process? So now that was like very big picture with restorative justice. We're going to dive a little bit out of the theory into what are some of the applications and how is it seen and how is it done in different places. So Here, you see a circle, and it's divided into three parts. We have prevention, 80%, intervention, 15%, reorientation, 5%. In my dream world, this is how restorative justice would be approached. When I say prevention, I really mean community building, building in like all of the aspects of building relationships goes here. So, like circles and restorative justice happening in schools, with your family, with friends, with your neighbors, in faith-based, all the places when you get to celebrate, or if you need a grieving circle, like all of those different places, like that's the prevention, right? So you're building the foundation of a relationship so that if something does happen, you have something actually to restore to. So that's the key. Like ideally, that would be the biggest part, the most investment that we would do as a community, as a society. Then with the intervention piece, like conflict is gonna happen. We're gonna harm one another. It's part of being, there's gonna be tension. It's just part of being human and the human experience. And we get to learn from that and grow and learn about ourselves. And so then the next piece would be like spending 15% of like our collective fiscal and human resources into that harm piece. And then the final piece of it, a much smaller piece, would be reorientation. So let's say someone had to step away. Maybe they weren't ready to take responsibility at the time and they needed to step away. How do we bring them back when they're ready, when the time's ready? How do we bring them back into the community to support a process and welcome them back for whatever reason they had to be distant from the community? And so right now, I would say we probably spend 80% or 70% of our time in intervention and 10% in reorientation or like bringing folks back, and then about 20% in community building. So I think a lot more energy should be shifted to prevention, and that way we can support and really invest. Like when something serious does happen, we have all the resources. It doesn't take time, right? Because we can really think and we can really focus on that intervention piece of it. So with looking at restorative justice, there are two. I'm sure you're very familiar with this. I saw this on your website as well. But these are, I love this framework and like looking at, we're talking about a paradigm. So there's one paradigm, the current criminal legal approach. Then we have the restorative justice approach, which is another paradigm. And if you look at the current criminal legal approach, what law was broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished? And that in comparison to the restorative justice approach, which is who has been harmed, what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs, right? The one on the left, the legal approach, it focuses on the rules, it focuses on the laws, it focuses on the person who's actually caused the harm. Whereas restorative justice, it centers on the person who's been harmed and what is needed so that they can move forward, so that they can and even if it's not move forward, but so that they can have what they need that supports them in healing or a process towards healing. And you'll notice that I say person harmed, the person responsible, survivor. And I use this language very intentionally. And we're talking about a paradigm shift. Language is really powerful. And with the language we use, especially around when we say like offender, it's labeling, and it holds someone in a moment of time based on an action that they've done. And so what, as Brian Stevenson has stated that we're more than the worst thing that we've done. And then we add to that at IJ that we're more than the worst thing we've done, but we're also more than the worst thing that we've experienced. And so giving folks the opportunity to use language that doesn't hold them in a moment of time. So that's why I use person harmed and person responsible. Restorative justice. So looking at this, this is also both of those last two slides were credited to Howard Zare. So harm and wrongdoing is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. That harm, that wrongdoing, that violation, it creates an obligation. The central obligation is to, as much as possible, do right by the people who've been harmed. And so even in a situation where there was a robbery or there was an assault, and you don't know, you don't know who did it, and you may never come back in contact, like that moment is still creating a relationship. And so that person still has needs, their life is different after that point. So how can we support that person in getting their needs met to support the healing process? Looking at, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our model, some impact justice. We have several elements. These are 4 of the elements. There'll be 4 more. But thinking about what are the different elements that support a restorative process. And so these are the elements that we have. So it's oriented around the person who's been harmed. Strength-based, so we really honor and we know that we support the survivor and we also support the person who's been harmed. Rooted in relationship and protects confidentiality. And the other pieces to that is that it centers racial equity, that it's pre-charge, so it's after arrest, but no involvement within the legal system, so as early as possible. Preventing from net whiting, so these are for serious cases with an identifiable person harm, and it's held by community. I'm going to go into, there's 8 of them, and we go into detail in our toolkit, and I can give you the link to that later, but I'm just going to focus on 3 of these right now for this conversation. So the types of cases we typically work with and that we support sites when working with are burglaries, assaults, vehicle, grand theft, robberies, arson, and there's many more. It depends on the different areas. And as I said before, this was someone who, this was an identifiable person harm. And the other requirement is that someone has to be willing to take responsibility. So looking at ending the criminalization of people of color, looking at racial and ethnic disparities and making sure that everyone has access to diversion. There's a way that you can design your program. So you focus on the area where youth of color are being arrested, what types of offenses youth of color are being arrested, and that's where you start, and then you center youth of color and then move from there. Removing boundaries around prior criminal history or probation status can also support ending criminalization of youth of color, and then also recognizing that communities of color are also survivors as well. Strength-based, right? So we recognize the dignity in all participants, the person who's caused the harm and the person harmed. And we create support system that we believe that people can take accountability. And we also believe that survivors and that people who've been harmed, they know what they need. And we can create a process so that they can say what they need and talk about the impact and ask the questions that they need so that they can support their journey towards healing. And the last one that I'm going to highlight for today is this created and held by community. So really valuing that community and the folks in the community know what they need. And this is not something that's brought to, it's not done by the legal system, but it's done by community, folks who probably have known many generations of people in that community. And also ensuring that folks who are impacted by the legal system have representation and that it mirrors the backgrounds of the folks who are working with them. Now looking at it a little bit, people are like, well, okay, those elements sound great. That sounds fabulous. Does this work? And so this is data collected from San Francisco County in California. And we look at recidivism and costs per youth, knowing that there are other indicators that we definitely want to look at, but these are a couple that we're looking at for right now. Recidivism is 53% for people who've gone through the legal system versus 13% recidivism of youth who've gone through restorative justice, which is like a big difference. And then if you look at the cost, it costs nearly $300,000 to detain a young person for a year versus $5.7 thousand to work with a young person for 6 to 9 months with a restorative process. Yes, people who've been harmed, like, how do you feel about this? 91% would participate in another conference, and 91% would also recommend the process to a friend. This just shows a map of different places that we're in partnership with who are doing restorative justice diversion. And restorative justice diversion is happening all over the country in many different places. This particular model of it being pre-charged with those 8 elements these are the places that it's occurring. And yeah, we're really excited to be in partnership with folks in different places. We get to learn, and the model is not like a standard. It's flexible, and so it gets to be adaptable based on the needs of the community. So really believing in community-based organizations to hold and where the work to live. I mentioned this earlier about our toolkit, but if you go to rjdtoolkit.org, you can find out so much more information. I know I'm kind of like skimming about like, what's this process? What's restorative justice? How's it done in the legal system for youth? And, like, how does it get referred to a community-based organization? There's a lot more information on our website. If you go here to the toolkit and so now we're back out, right? So that was the information, some of the nuts and bolts about the mechanics. Okay, so we're on this bridge. Some people might see this bridge and they're like, woo, fun, yes, let's run across. Other people are like, I'm not walking across that bridge. Is it stable? Do we have to go to the other side? Is there another way to get there? And this is what I think about, like, as we enter into a new year. And also, like, when we enter and we do something new, especially around restorative justice diversion. How do we move through this work? How do we see our challenges for what they are and be able to move collectively together with consensus and see the opportunities in that? And so for me, what I've learned is that restorative justice, it asks me to be whole with myself. And I find that wholeness in seeing other people and being in shared spaces with other people. And that no one is disposable. And so Oprah Winfrey often talks about that she's interviewed so many people from so many backgrounds, so many economic status, like different political backgrounds, everything. She's so many people. And she's just names that, like, most people just want to be heard, right? And so restorative justice creates the opportunity for people to be heard, for them to be seen, for them to be listened to, and for them to also listen to one another. And, and also, like, sometimes people are like, oh, everybody, you have to agree with everything. No, that's not what's happening. That agreement does not mean being heard, or, right? But you get to have those conversations and you get to discuss. And you may agree or may disagree, but you get to work it out. And so thinking about, when we think about where we're at with restorative justice, and we're also where we're at as a nation, being very vigilant about racial justice and centering racial equity. And so restorative justice is great. And in order to really support that, you have to have this other pillar of really doing the work to work on implicit bias, to root out white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And how do you do that in relationship with restorative justice? And when you do those two things, you create an environment for people to thrive and for people to be seen. The way, like, structural oppression works is that oftentimes, like, it's happening so much, so often, it feels like sometimes it happens in silos, or it's happening to you by yourself. And so if you see something, if you notice something, addressing it and having the conversations. And if someone says something to you, being able to have the space and the framework to really address tensions around and questions and concerns that folks have, especially around race and equity. I'm going to share a little video with you that I created. This is a longer video of like 8 minutes of me dancing. I was just really inspired. It was probably close, like when things were difficult here, right after the fresh air. We got some fresh air, and in the midst of the election, just wanting to express myself. So this is a small clip of it that I'm going to play for you.
Say what you heard, so you can see what you said. Say what you heard, so you can see what you said. Oh, pray these words take the limits off Take the limits off, 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 take Said I see increase all around me. Stretch for, break for, release me. Enlarge my territory. Say, enlarge my territory. Take the limits off of me, oh Lord. Yeah. Enlarge my territory. Enlarge my territory. Oh. Enlarge my territory. It's a time of favor. It's a time of rain. It's a time of increase. It's a time of harvest. It's a time for reaping. You've sown in many tears. You've sown countless nights. You've paced your floor back and forth. You've believed. You've stood on words that you have yet to see come to pass. But this is the time for rain. Ask for the rain.
And thank y'all, but thank you. And so what can you do? And so some action steps for everybody. One is, as we're talking about the paradigm shift, think about like what are the ways in which your language and how you can use language that is inclusive, and that shifts the paradigm. And so I invite you to think about how language change, around like person harm, person responsible. Like a lot of folks love to do trainings. You have the Center for Community Justice, and like get trainings and practice. So do it with your family, do it with your friends, do it with your loved ones. Like really just continue to be in spaces and build relationships, and it will come. And then continue to be advocates, working to shrink the system that has harmed so many people. And the system, I'm talking about the legal system. Shrinking that and growing restorative justice, investing in restorative justice, and thinking about ways that, along with the paradigm shift in the language, the punitive ways that we are with one another, myself included. I have to think about this all the time because it's kind of like the way things are done here in the States. And so folks say like no justice, no peace. And then I think about Dr. King, who this terminology came from, thinking about like, when justice is everywhere, right? When justice is the norm, peace will just rain down. And not saying that things will be peaceful always, as I mentioned, like there's going to be conflict, there's going to be tension, there's going to be harm, right? But we have the tools to address that and work through that. And then continue to be advocates for folks, especially for folks who are on the margins, who may not have as much access to power, and being able to use your privilege and your power that you have to support someone else who may and center those who are on the margins. And so with that being said, This is a quote by the first African American female astronaut, Dr. Mae Jemison. Never be limited by other people's imagination. So as we return to ourselves, you have the answers, you have the gifts, y'all have a community. And I invite you to use your imagination and create the world that you want to see, and that you're already doing it. You've already planted the seeds. So thank you. It's a pleasure. I will be able to join y'all with some questions and answers very shortly. And it's been really a pleasure. So take care.